on the ground. Okay, we're recording. Second, we actually help create and scale impact on the ground, on sea, land, and city. So we might do that with individual businesses or organizations who are looking to affect change. That could be on specific type of interventions relating to nature and nature-based solutions, but we also work across collectives to catalyze change at larger scale. And then thirdly, we work on powerful communications to actually inspire, educate, and connect people to nature and impact. Brilliant. Over to Ben to do a brief introduction on Business Declares, who are our partner today on the webinar.
Hi everybody, good morning. It's fantastic to be here. Great to see so many people, and thank you for choosing to join this webinar when there's 1,000,001 other things to do. So I'm a director of Business Declares. Essentially, we're a network organisation and we're all about action. We're all about helping organisations tackle the climate, ecological and social crisis through taking concrete, pragmatic and sustainable actions, both on a personal level and on a business level. And I guess at the core of this is our belief that along with citizens and governments, businesses is the third leg of the stool, if you like. Businesses is a vital component for tackling this crisis. That's one of our fundamental beliefs. And another fundamental belief is that tackling this crisis is actually good for business. The climate crisis is creating instability. Businesses hate instability. And by tackling it, we create resilience, we help future-proof businesses, etc. What we do essentially is three things. We provide tools, good practice, and content to our network members, and we provide that through our network of organizations. We have micro businesses, we have multinationals. These include Triodos, these include Body Shop, and Riverford, to name but three. And those organizations and their colleagues have a wealth of good practice and information that we share across our network. The second thing we do is we help our members navigate some really difficult questions through our series of events. So questions like, how do I think about degrowth and making a profit? Where do I start with my carbon footprint? I'm really overwhelmed. What is offsetting in nature-based solutions, and how can I be sure of its authenticity? Those are the sorts of questions that we run events on. And then thirdly, we collaborate with other networks. We are not like Race to Zero and Nigel Topping and the Climate Champions, for example, in the run-up to COP. We are not here to compete. We are here to be additive to other networks. And just by way of quick segue into the next section, you know, I'm sure people understand the level of biodiversity crisis that we are in. The UK has lost more biodiversity than any other G7 country. We're in the bottom 10% globally. And yet, of course, biodiversity in all its forms and nature in all its forms is essential for the survival of the human race. It's our life support system. We are not some kind of dispassionate observer from the outside looking in. We are part of it. And for too long, businesses have failed to take into account the impacts that they cause on the climate and the biodiversity. But this has to change, and so the topic of nature-based solutions and how it links with businesses will only ever increase exponentially in importance. So it's now time for businesses to seriously engage with this topic and get behind that. So on that note, I'll hand back to Mairead.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ben. So to state and to build on Ben's point, to state the very obvious, the health of business and nature are directly connected now more than ever before. We know that, of course, 50% of the world's GDP is directly related on nature's resources and ecosystems. And we only have to look at the last couple of years to see how, from floods to droughts to wildfires to impacts on transportation, that this has only increased and will only increase more. And so our provocation would be that actually every business in different ways, depending on the nature of their business and their industry, is going to need to adapt and transform how it works with nature, both to survive and to thrive. And actually, we don't think that's by 2030, we think that's now. Interestingly, while nature is often talked about as a risk or charitable exercise for business, in fact, there are very distinct benefits to business of a nature positive strategy. And as we mentioned, we are about helping business on nature positive solutions. So we thought we'd just share with you 5 benefits to business of actually working with nature. And just as an interesting statistic, which I think is fascinating, is that while many businesses today have a sustainability strategy, many businesses on this webinar will have a sustainability strategy, a climate strategy, possibly a net zero commitment, very few have a nature strategy. And actually a 2020 CDP report showed that less than 1% of the companies that they surveyed actually report on nature-related risks, only 1%, versus 97% reporting on climate risks. And on the opportunity side of that coin, only 15% of some of these leading companies actually officially recognize nature as an opportunity versus 70% seeing climate as an opportunity. So what that tells us is it's a major yawning gap in terms of being really recognized as an opportunity and risk. And that's why it is such an opportunity to look at it now for so many businesses and actually get on the front foot. Yep, next one. So on to the 5. Probably the first one is one that people will be most familiar with, which is the opportunity for nature and nature-based solutions to contribute towards climate, carbon and net zero goals. Interestingly, it's estimated that roughly 37% of climate mitigation could be effectively achieved through nature-based solutions, which are not only more cost-effective than many alternatives, they also come with the benefit of delivering broader value in terms of biodiversity goals and community goals. And yet, interestingly, nature-based solutions or climate-based solutions actually only receive 3% of global finance today. So again, quite an unrealized opportunity, but certainly for businesses on the call, there is that opportunity to align biodiversity and nature with achieving contribution towards net zero commitments, along, of course, with heavy carbon reductions. Yep, on to the next one, Heather. So secondly is the opportunity to create regenerative products and services to grow business. Interestingly, the World Economic Forum estimates, and this is kind of a mind-blowing number, that the business opportunity of the transition to nature positive is worth roughly $3.5 trillion between now or by 2030. And that's just looking at food, land and ocean. Now that's a wild, mind-boggling number, but what it really means in real terms for the businesses on the call today is that there's a real opportunity to look at nature and regenerative solutions for whatever product or service you offer. Moving to more regenerative models offers the opportunity for lower costs, more resilience, new revenue streams, and actually potentially more attraction to customers and employees who are looking for that. And on to the next one. This is quite a powerful one, actually, which is that we know that increasingly nature positive businesses in the UK are going to have access to cheaper capital. So that's a really interesting finance opportunity for businesses in making the transition now to being more nature positive. And the other aspect to that, of course, is that, as many of you know, nature and biodiversity is following in the footsteps of climate and carbon in the sense that it will be more measured and more regulated. And we've got task force for nature related financial disclosures in action. We've got net gain biodiversity requirements. We've got the new environmental bill. So everything's moving in that direction where business will be held more accountable for its impact and use of natural resources. So again, reason to get sort of on the front foot now with that. Fourth one is that is the opportunity to, of course, build a resilient business. No business, every business, I should say, is dependent, as we said before, through its supply chain, through its use of natural resources, physical assets, transportation, ultimately dependent on nature, climate, and natural ecosystems. And so looking at that from a more strategic perspective and looking at how you can increase resilience and reduce costs and exposure is really key. So that can be anything from thinking about, how to source more locally, how to support more climate adaptive ecosystems in your area, etc. There's a swathe of them, but again, powerful advantages to doing so. And the fifth one is actually people-oriented. Fundamentally, people are increasingly demanding and expecting action on climate and nature, both as employees who want to be part of purposeful organizations who are delivering value and impact, and also as customers. And that has all the metrics only show it that going kind of in an increasingly positive direction. So again, getting on the front foot in demonstrating credible action, not just in saying a commitment towards a goal that's 10 years out, but actually, this is what we're doing today. This is part of actual initiatives and actions we're taking as a business, and supporting as a result our customers and employees to be part of. And obviously investors are only going to want to see more of that. So very briefly, for any avoidance of doubt, because it is a vast subject and not yet sort of fully officially defined actually, but we go with the IUCN definition of nature-based solutions, which at their heart are really about protecting, managing and restoring natural and semi-natural ecosystems that help us deal with societal challenges and that deliver human and nature and biodiversity benefits. And when we use words like fully functioning ecosystems, they can sound a little sterile, can't they? But actually they're anything but, because they're really at the heartland of us having food supplies and nutrition and good soil that can grow food, and clean air and water, protection from flooding and drought, and is at the heart of all of our health and well-being. So while they can sound quite lofty, in reality it's something that we interact with as humans every single day. And we're going to be coming on to more of this through the panel discussion. But essentially, interestingly, we don't, at the greenhouse, we don't look at just one type of intervention. Actually, we very much believe that it's about looking at diversity across different types of nature-based solutions. And it's all about, depending on what business you are or what organization, what makes most sense in terms of your contribution. So if you're just a distillery in the coastline of Scotland, then clearly you're highly dependent on water, both as a part of your product, but also because you're on that coastline and it's part of the whiskey making process, versus if you are an agricultural business where you're going to be more land oriented, etc. So we very much actually work strategically with businesses around that. But essentially today we'll be covering everything from peatland restoration and management through to woodland creation and management, regenerative agriculture, soil and land use, through to, you can consider coastal interventions, from seagrass and kelp forest to how we actually deliver clean water, which, as you know, has become a big issue and under the spotlight recently. And then let's not forget, this isn't just about, although, broader land, rural areas and coastal is so important to us here in the UK, let's not forget that so many of us live in urban areas. And so actually creating accessible green and blue spaces in our urban areas is also a huge opportunity, as also a means to connect people back to nature. And then lastly, again, I think I've touched on this a little bit, but so often nature-based solutions are seen predominantly as businesses seeing it as a functional, we would describe it, opportunity to offset carbon, either for their individual products or as a business as a whole in terms of their operations. And so they're that sort of functional relationship, which often can be completely disconnected to who they are as a business in terms of buying carbon credits. It might be across the world, and disconnected to the nature of what a business actually does. And while, yes, that's one part of what nature-based solutions can deliver, if we widen the aperture and widen the lens, what we actually see that if done right, and it's very much at the heart of our ethos and strategy, is done right, yes, it can do carbon sequestration towards net zero, but it can also, as we've just been discussing, protect critical natural resources and assets that a business is dependent on. It can support local communities and generate economic opportunities if you're actually doing nature-based solutions that link to your physical presence and your areas of operation. It can critically actually also provide health and well-being benefits, partly for the communities and people that are directly engaging with them, but actually also for employees, because of the opportunity that more sort of locally nature-based solutions present for direct engagement with them. Yeah. And then lastly, sorry, we get to choose, it has the opportunity to build a resilient business. So we think actually widening this is so important for realizing the full benefits that nature-based solutions can present to business. And with that, we would just wrap up and say, actually, looking at more of who you are as a business in terms of your strategy, your core strengths, your products and services, your supply chain, people, and physical presence. When looking at it from that perspective, we can start to design really exciting nature-based solutions that deliver not only impact on climate and biodiversity, but also deliver benefits for your business and your people and your communities. And that's really at the heart of our, I guess, what we're about helping to achieve here at the Greenhouse. So with that, I think we've wrapped up the first section, I believe. Is that right, Heather? Yes.
That's right. Thanks, Mairead, for that great overview on the benefits of nature-based solutions. We're now going to be moving on to hearing from our panelists. So we've got Rory from Arup, Zac from Riverford, and Tom from Triodos, followed by a few questions from Mairead. Feel free to think about any questions you might want to ask them, pop them in the chat box, and I'll be picking out a few questions at the end of the presentation around 12:50. So over to you, Rory.
Thank you, Heather. Indeed, it's a pleasure to be here and speaking at the panel event. I think Mairead touched on a couple of very important points, which I'll circle back to in a second. So just by way of a little bit of context and a little bit of an introduction, I work for Arup. It's specifically Arup is a multi-disc design firm, multidisciplinary design and construction engineering firm. We're probably best known for sort of iconic builds like Sydney Opera House, but largely we work in cities. We design and build cities. That's really our stock and trade in essence. And I'm glad Mairead referred to the cities, the urban link. That's incredibly important because it's estimated by 2050, 70% of the global population will live in urban areas. And we have to consider cities in the sense that they're you know, in a spatial setting, in the sense that they're the actual footprint of the city, what goes on within the city in terms of its impact on biodiversity, but also within a catchment, its wider area in terms of drawing on water, but equally globally, its global footprint. So has a massive impact on nature. I'm just going to allude to a very quick case study we did here in London, central London, which is the Wild West End project. And it kind of demonstrates or encapsulates the integration of nature-based solutions with green infrastructure and such like. So Arup worked with the Crown Estate to prepare effectively an ecological master plan. And this was a corporate strategy which effectively set out objectives, quantified targets, and provided guidance for the organization itself in terms of implementation of nature-based solutions across new asset and existing asset. And that's really important. So there was aspects of retrofitting. Crucially, though, it was also supported by the Greater London Authority and indeed London Wildlife Trust. And indeed, the strategy combined to the wider broader sort of strategies around open space and provision of open space for residents, tourists, workers, etc. And it culminated in this green corridor, which effectively ran through the West End. And that's really important in terms of ecological processes, that you have permeability, what we refer to permeability, the ability for ecological cycles and systems to function, to move, species even to move. And that's key, because I'll come on to that in a second, why that's important. Underpinning this strategy, and this is again important, which I'll circle back to in a second, quite a bit to circle back to, that we develop natural capital metrics. And that's really important because natural capital is a mechanism, a functional mechanism to encapsulate these additional benefits, the environmental externalities, to effectively quantify some of these, which were previously sort of nebulous attributes, that the sort of benefits that you got from biodiversity. And now we could quantify those. And equally for the Crown Estate, that was important in terms of how it managed its stock to ensure the supply of those benefits and services, but also facilitated its own reporting and corporate reporting. Next slide, Heather, please. So in terms of just some tips, really, from my perspective, Mairead mentioned legislation and the Environment Bill in the UK. That's really important. But and equally, everyone will be aware of COP26. We've just come out the other side of that in the last couple of weeks in terms of the climate COP that was held in Glasgow. But prior to that, we had a really important other COP, the silent COP, which was COP15. And that's the biodiversity COP that was held in October rather in China. It was broken into two parts because of COVID, and it will be ratified in May next year. But that's really important because that will produce the global biodiversity framework. And from those targets within that, we'll see cascade of initiatives into legislation, national legislation. And two particular targets are worth pointing out. Target 12 in the context of cities, which is an underpinning requirement to deliver for urban space, open space for residents, and equitable access to nature. And also Target 15, which is again really important. And that's about how, for the first time, there's an onus or a responsibility on the private sector to report on biodiversity, to account for its impact and dependencies on nature. And actually, that's where the natural capital cycle comes back in terms of to enable that reporting, there's a requirement to mainstream natural capital approaches within a business operations. That's really crucial. And the interventions then, in terms of, say, application of innovation or digital solutions, will culminate or converge around nature-based solutions. Going back to my point, the earlier point, in terms of considering the systemic values of nature, in order to ensure that we deliver these services and benefits and that the nature-based solutions are fit for purpose, they're not greenwash, we have to ensure that the systems are healthy, they're biodiverse. They're biodiverse, they're more resilient, they provide more services, etc. So that's really important. We have to ensure the integrity of the biodiversity within the system. And again, in terms of local communities, this is all important as regards development of nature-based solutions and implementation. Indeed, more recent research shows that most nature-based solutions will fail unless they're embedded and there's been engagement with local communities. That's really important. Also, for many businesses on the call today, there's a fantastic opportunity, as again Mairead referred to be on a front foot, to be a forerunner in terms of impending regulation and legislation. There's an ability to be an advocate, to actually pave the way in terms of the nature positive journey. That's really important. And that may entail training employees. Effectively, what I'd refer to is developing nature literacy within your organization. That's really important, and building the sort of governance structures internally as well. And on that note, I'll finish up there.
Thanks so much, Rory. Over to Zac. Oh no, over to Tom from Triodos. Let me just.
Thanks, Heather. Hi, everyone. I work in the corporate finance team at Triodos Bank, which is the advisory team at the bank. And for those of you who don't know Triodos, we're a European bank with a mission to make money work for positive change. So effectively, we connect savers and investors who want to change the world with sustainable entrepreneurs, organizations, and companies in selected sectors. We've been leaders in renewable energy and investment and community ownership, and in more recent years, we've been exploring models for investing in nature in the UK. And as Mairead covered, there's a significant sort of amount of benefits for business for doing this now. And the project which you can see here is one of the nature-based solution projects pilots which we've been working on. And having sort of scoured the UK for dozens of projects, we partnered with DEFRA, the Environment Agency, and Esme Fairbairn Foundation to develop these pilot NBS projects, with ultimately the aim of learning what is scalable and replicable in different habitats and environments across the country. So this project, the Wyre Natural Flood Management Project, which was initiated by the Rivers Trust, is all about alternatives to hard engineered flood risk management solutions. And as Mairead said before, these alternatives, these natural alternatives, they have multiple environmental benefits. And you can just see some of them on here on the slide in terms of carbon sequestration, habitat creation, water quality improvement, all delivered from interventions such as leaky dams, peatland restoration, the sort of incorporation of wetlands in the catchment and afforestation. So this project in particular is located in the Wyre catchment in Lancashire, around Churchtown, which is a community at high risk from flooding. Significant flood events over the last 10 years where quite a number of properties were flooded. Ironically, the project launch event was actually postponed because the EA had to respond to heavy flooding across the UK after 3 successive storms, during the winter. And this project has been developed around hydrological modelling at the start. So we've sort of, that assessment has shown that 70 hectares of NFM features could reduce the flood frequency in Churchtown for 120 properties. And in addition to that, we've also sort of gone down the route of using the opportunity to encourage and engage with landowners to plant native woodland. So 40 hectares of woodland creation has been secured here as well. And the flooding of properties in Churchtown, aside from the environmental benefits, which there's a significant number, there's also economic drivers for that community and for stakeholders involved. And the Rivers Trust have calculated that a 1 in 50 year flood event where 56 properties are flooded costs about £2 million in insurance claims. So a direct sort of hard number for certain businesses to focus on. And even more worrying, I guess, is a 1 in 50 year flood event has occurred 4 times in the last 20 years. So these flood events, which were once deemed sort of obviously far less frequent, are now becoming more severe and more often. So this project is sort of focused around developing a not-for-profit company, which is going to be at the heart of overseeing this intervention delivery program, working with local partners and entering into and facilitating agreements and payments with landowners and the buyers of ecosystem services, of which we've got public bodies and private organisations and businesses involved in terms of acquiring the carbon, paying for natural flood management, risk reduction and habitat units as well. And on top of that as well, the not-for-profit company, back to one of the points Mairead made earlier on the webinar, they can serve as an investment vehicle and access cheaper cost of capital. Next slide, please. So taking my learning from some of these pilot MBS projects which I'm working on, I think it's really important to recognise the complexity of them. In terms of stacking ecosystem services, knowledge in terms of understanding exactly what habitat improvements need to be made, and with that, there's quite likely a number of stakeholders going to be involved. And I think it's really important that partnerships are formed and everyone gets behind a shared vision and goal at the outset. So engaging with organisations within your area on nature-based solutions that align with your aims in terms of delivering net zero and your nature and sustainability strategies is really key, I think, to engaging in the space. And with that, and following on from that, an open book approach, I think it just helps everyone when you really know what your organisation values and sort of what value drivers and requirements are, so we can unlock those sort of, I guess, key decision-making processes to ultimately arrive at delivering the project. And then finally, building on from that as well, is given there are sort of quite a significant number of different roles stakeholders can play, certain organisations will feel they're sort of best suited to play the role of investor or landowner, giving people access to deliver those nature-based solutions, or even enter into volunteering programs to help the projects be delivered. So I think sort of understanding sort of, I guess, the overall stakeholder map and assessing where your organisation can support these projects is really key as well. And I think that's on to Zac now. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much, Tom. Over to Zac from Riverford.
Cool, thanks. Hi everyone, thanks for the opportunity to speak at this event. My name's Zac, I'm Head of Sustainability for Riverford Organic Farmers. We're an organic veg box business that delivers nationwide. We've got 3 of our own farms and then a broad supply base throughout the UK and in Southern Europe. So as a business, we've been measuring our carbon footprint for the last few years, and we've recently completed a baseline biodiversity survey on the farms that we own. And then we've also had work completed with the West Country Rivers Trust to assess soil risk erosion on our Devon farms, very hilly, and the impact on local watercourses. So we've got a trifecta of aspects that we're considering, so carbon, biodiversity and water, when we're looking at how we approach nature-based solutions. But most crucially, we're looking to our own farms and within the supply base in order to integrate nature-based solutions, because as a farming business, we're obviously fortunate to be tied to the landscape in this way. So this is a really important point because around 70% of England's landscape is agricultural land, and then agriculture is one of the main drivers, as I'm sure you all know, of biodiversity loss in the UK. And it's also around 10% of overall UK greenhouse gas emissions. So the integration of nature-based solutions into the agricultural landscape is a really logical route for us. And there's also a lot of opportunity for us to generate meaningful benefits to ecosystem services in this way. So Riverford's approach is broadly focused on regen ag, and specifically we're investigating and beginning to enact key nature-based solutions that incorporate soil carbon management, hedgerow restoration and improvement, and agroforestry systems. So I'm going to speak about one of these today that imminently we're getting off the ground, which is the use of nut-based agroforestry systems, also known as silver pasture, in West Country livestock farms. So the case study is essentially Riverford has a refer a friend scheme which neutralises the costs of nut tree agroforestry establishment for farmers, and this allows us to create a nature-based solution from this within the supply base. The problem that we're trying to solve here is that our agricultural systems in the UK don't currently deliver the level of carbon sequestration, biodiversity or flood retention or other ecosystem services that we totally require. So we want to tackle this without detriment to farm businesses. Every customer that refers a friend to Riverford and signs up to a regular box order will plant a tree into a silver pastoral nut system in the UK. So we've directed a proportion of customer acquisition budget to cover the establishment cost of nut trees to farmers. So for walnuts, hazelnuts and chestnuts, this will include purchasing the tree, the fencing, planting costs, and a few years weeding or general labour to get the tree to a level where it's established. At the moment, the target group is livestock farmers, because the trees can then be planted on slopes that are typically too steep to plant veg on, but that would be used for grazing. So the animals continue to graze with minimal to no loss of income from the excluded strips of trees. And then this begins to generate carbon payments, a growing high value nut crop, and then we're starting to establish a carbon payment system with the participating farmers who will be buying the carbon back from as a business. And this provides a range of benefits. So we're expecting upwards of 25 tonne of carbon per acre over 30 years to be generated in these systems, as I mentioned, which we'll be purchasing back from the farmer. The soil health improvements are massively, well, a lot of the literature is showing us that this is going to be the case, and some farmers that we've already spoken to have seen yield improvements close to agroforestry systems. But you've also got improved nutrient status, higher soil carbon, higher abundance of soil invertebrates, and massively improved infiltration rates. So you help to deal with flooding impacts in that way. It's also crucially providing economic diversification for farmers. So it allows enterprise stacking. So you've got high value nut crops, carbon income, and then no loss of livestock income. For example, some walnut sales might generate up to around an additional £1,400 or £1,500 per acre by year 10 for the farmers. Then we've got, coming out of this, reduced reliance on livestock income. So this basically reduces the chance of eroding environmental best practice in livestock farming. Go to the next slide, please, Heather. So in terms of the kind of tips for that we found, as alluded to by Tom, we need to stack the benefits that are in nature-based solutions projects. Don't just look at one ecosystem service. Utilize stewardship schemes for biodiversity if you're in an agricultural setting. Plant the right trees to sequester significant quantities of carbon. And make sure if it is, as I'm chatting about agriculture, it is providing a high value crop as well where possible to allow farmers' businesses to succeed alongside this. It's also important not to let measurement get in the way of positive action. So we succumb to this a little bit at the start of our projects because there is actually no agroforestry carbon code. So we're taking this into our own hands and developing the best available methods and evidence to develop something internally within the business to allow us to monitor the progress of these agroforestry projects. It's also really important to consider socioeconomic impacts and benefits because landowners and the public are obviously going to be tied to these projects as well. So crucially, it's got to work for landowners and their business models, and the public needs to have access to nature-based solutions in some respects, or they can never learn from them or enjoy the benefits of them and help perpetuate them. For example, nature connection is obviously very important for humans. Also core to some of Murray's messaging in that nature-based solutions need to be linked to your business. Random affiliations are going to have less positive impact. So if you're close to the projects you're working on, both geographically and in terms of the subject matter, you're going to have more to offer in terms of beneficial project development. And lastly, try and use a bit of cathedral thinking. What would your grandchildren say about your actions? There's a saying that goes, if you're thinking a year ahead, plant rice. If you're thinking 10 years ahead, plant trees. If you're thinking 100 years ahead, educate children. So what I'm getting at is don't just think about the system that's being developed now. The things that we do now need to work for the generations ahead of us. They need to be learned from and improved, and they need longevity. And this kind of speaks to what Rory was mentioning about embedding and educating communities where nature-based solutions are being stewarded. That's everything from me.
Great, thanks so much, Zac. So I'm just going to pass over to Mairead and the panelists. We've probably got time for a few quick questions between them before we move on to the rest of the presentation.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much, Heather, and to all the panelists as well. We're going to have a few quick questions now, and then we're going to have a broader Q&A at the end. So for everyone watching, everyone on the webinar, please do add your questions in now about anything so far, because we'll be collecting them as we go. But just some immediate ones. I've seen one already from Ben. Ben, don't worry, I've got that one. We'll get that one answered now. Just a quick one to each of you. So I think firstly, Tom, picking up on what you mentioned, now obviously Triodos is in this specific role of finance and helping to, help catalyze investment, which is so important. But you touched on it, but I think because we had our chat yesterday and you said some really great things on the call, I thought you could just share them again now, which is, but if you're a business and you're sitting here as a business, which is many people on the call are, or you're an agency working with businesses, what are some of the very practical ways, if you can run through them again, because I know we're very aligned on this, some of the practical ways that businesses can get involved with and support nature-based solutions, and some of the ways you're seeing that happen with these 4 or 5 pilot projects you're currently working on?
Yeah, thanks, Mairead. I think there's back to what I was referring in terms of the different roles that you can take within these projects. At the heart, you have a not-for-profit company, which a project lead, project sponsor is ultimately delivering, in charge of delivering the project. So that, for some businesses, that might work. They want to take on the ownership. They have an idea of in terms of a nature-based solution, or they might want to partner with a local conservation organisation to do that. But aside from that, investment is required. So certain organisations might want to invest in these and provide the upfront capital, to cover the upfront capital costs, and look to invest directly in that not-for-profit company. On top of that, and which is absolutely crucial for these projects being a success, we need buyers of these ecosystem services. So whether that's buying the carbon credits or the biodiversity, habitat units, or NFM in the case of the wire catchment projects, that's absolutely key. So buyers of people sort of actually, coming and engaging with that not-for-profit company and looking to be the purchaser of those ecosystem services is crucial to enabling those projects to proceed. On top of that, as well as volunteering, as I said before, organisations might want to engage with local projects and help the delivery and the ongoing maintenance of them. So I think it's that being the off-taker of those ecosystem services is absolutely key, and that's something which, in our experience, along with landowners, engaging with landowners and getting them to sort of ultimately come into agreements with the companies, those two elements are, you know, incredibly hard, and some organisations might have assets to offer as well. So in terms of land.
Thank you, Tom. And then one for Rory, which picks up on Ben's piece, which, look, we know measurement is obviously a major challenge and question when it comes to biodiversity, but just Rory, in a couple of sentences or so, any reflections on, because you're close to obviously the work around the reporting and measurement side, any reflections on when you think we're going to see more of that, or anything you can share on that in relation to Ben's question on soil health as well?
Sure, Mairead. Yeah, I mean, the nature positive journey, that just everyone's clear that this is the equivalent, this is the biodiversity nature equivalent to net zero. So nature positive, that's the mantra, that's the standard to marshal behind. Point is, there's a degree of fluidity around the definition that is consolidating, but it's deliberately fluid at the moment to enable us to really navigate the complexity of measuring biodiversity. Really very, very difficult. We don't have the currency of carbon. So there's a host of metrics out there at the moment. They're often sectorially divided in terms of extractives or different business sectors and so on. However, the frameworks are coming, which will effectively enable the use or signposting to some of these measurement tools in essence. And the one to watch is Science-Based Targets for Nature. So that's the sister Science-Based Targets Initiative for Climate. That's most definitely the one to follow. There's already corporate guidance, and there's a protocol and steps to follow. However, you can only progress so far because they're still developing the other steps, as it were. And that's, again, reiterating the complexity around biodiversity. Just to finish on the point that biodiversity, it's immensely complex. It's dynamic, it has emergent properties. That means different configurations deliver different benefits and services. So it's not something we can pigeonhole easily, but the work is getting there. And as everyone is saying, you know, we can't let perfect be the enemy of good, etc. That kind of analogy in terms of we still need to crack on and work with what we've got.
Brilliant. And then I think we will close, Zac, with one question for you, and then we'll move on to Project Now briefly before the broader Q&A, which is a question coming through. Rather than offsetting and credits, how do we encourage brands to invest in ingredients that regenerate soils to improve ecosystem services? Organic farming is still too costly for many brands in the UK, and my understanding is that degenerative farming methods are still subsidised. That's a question coming from the panel, from the audience. Zac, is that one you'd like to respond to with any immediate thoughts?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I mean, an initial barrier to this is the cost, as mentioned, that some of these regenerative products would incur. There's also, you know, a broad lack of regenerative farming in the supply base in the UK and in Europe. It is improving, but yeah, there is still a general lack of that. So a way that we've found, as I mentioned with the agroforestry project we're trialing, is one is to help that finance along, basically. So if you can neutralize things for farmers, then you're allowing that to proliferate. So you're allowing those products to exist in the first place, because there are huge barriers to regenerative farming for farmers. And if they don't have the finance and the confidence in a brand, it's going to take up that product and provide additional benefits like carbon payments or voluntary payments for biodiversity, then they don't have the impetus to get started. So there needs to be some investment in supply chain from brands, but also a big part of it in terms of tackling the issue of customers paying more for products that are produced in a way that's better for the environment and for our soils, is taking people on the journey. Sometimes people are unwilling to make that plunge to buy a higher value product, because they don't fully understand the things that are happening in farming and in supply base in particularly. They don't know that organic it's not necessarily perfect, but they don't know that organic is actually doing stuff that is a lot better than standard agriculture in many ways. If we bring people along on the journey of the trials and tribulations, if you like, that a farmer has to go through to improve products and improve soils in this way, then you can kind of get people to understand why they're paying that premium for stuff. So it's kind of looking at both ends of the scale there.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So we're going to dive briefly into Project Now as an example, and then we're going to circle back round to the full panel for any questions from the audience. I know there's been a couple already popping up in the chat box. Do add some more if you would like now. So I think really circling around on what so much of what we have been talking about today is this big opportunity for business to realize both impact and value by working with nature. And actually, while of course we do work with individual brands and organizations, we are spearheading Project Now, which is a business collaboration to catalyze UK nature-based solutions and impact. So if you're wondering as a business, this seems rather complex, how do we actually do nature-based solutions in a way that we can afford and that realize benefits for us as a business, as well as contribute to the climate and ecological crises which we're facing, which is severe, then Project Now. So Heather, next slide, please. So the concept is this: we know in the UK that we are facing a severe biodiversity in nature and linked to that climate crises. We also know that the government has committed us to a 30% of land protected for nature by 2030. That's in 8 years' time. We're at about 13% today. We also know that so much of our food is dependent on us being able to have a healthier soil and regenerative systems in place. And actually, we think, why not start here? Why not unleash the imagination, will, and resources of the private sector to show what it can really do when it puts its imagination to such an intrinsic challenge? And going on to the next slide there, Heather, the way we plan to do this is we're actually going to identify and map. So for businesses that are keen to be involved with nature-based solutions, but again, in a cost-effective way and in a quite practical way, by being part of Project Now, you would have access to essentially a very diverse range of nature-based solutions across land, sea, and city that directly link to your strategy and who you are as a business, and actually present genuine opportunities right now for business engagement and for you to realize both impact and opportunity. So they'll be diverse. They'll cover from peatland restoration projects through to woodland management and creation projects, coastal and clean water sources, urban green and blue opportunities, regenerative agriculture and soil and land use, and broader rewilding projects. The reason we think it's so powerful to look at this in combination is that so many businesses are either looking at silo projects or they're looking at other businesses just looking at one lens of specifically woodlands or specifically regenerative agriculture. Why don't we start to connect the dots and look at how, when we come together, we can realize these opportunities in a more cost-effective way? And the next slide builds on what I've said. So we'll then, by mapping these high-value projects, connect individual businesses who are part of Project Now to projects that can deliver multiple benefits, which will be measured through partnerships to the best of our current ability with data available. And we'll also, back to Tom's point, be looking to ignite a pipeline of new projects that help to catalyze private sector engagement and demonstrate new business models for impact. Thirdly, and critically, we'll actually be engaging the businesses who are part of Project Now. The people will be involved. And that's key, because so often when you're just buying carbon credits, for example, you're disconnected and your people are disconnected from that actual impact. By looking at UK projects that align to who you are as a business, you actually get to also upskill and engage your people directly with direct access to those projects. Because after all, this isn't just a nature issue, this is a human issue. It's about how we are regenerating humans in this process and upskilling ourselves and our connection to nature through direct engagement. And then lastly, I think, Heather, we have 4, which is that we'll be looking to also most critically communicate this impact for businesses that are involved, so they can really connect their customers and investors in on the journey. Because as Zac was saying, so often people don't actually have a connection to what is going on the ground or in the ocean. And by being part of a project where you're actually delivering impact, that is such a powerful way to then engage customers and broader community and employees around that journey that they can be a part of. And then in summary, before we move on to the Q&A, some of the benefits for business partners of being part of Project Now is obviously through access to high value, nature-based projects that you can get behind, that also contributes to your net zero goals. Secondly, it demonstrates broader impact and action that you're taking on climate, biodiversity and employment in the UK. So beyond just sort of 2030 targets, this is something we're doing now and it's having measurable impact. Third is that by going towards a nature positive journey, you'll be able to also likely access cheaper capital and get on the front foot of nature-based regulation. It's the upskilling and engagement opportunities for your team and people that I just mentioned. And it's being part of helping to drive catalytic impact in energizing private sector engagement around nature-based solutions. And lastly, by being part of a group project rather than a solo project, you're going to get more outsized benefits versus cost. So with that, I will close that piece because I'm also conscious of time and hand back to Heather. Thank you.
Thanks, Mairead. Right. Q&A time. So if you want to just take a moment and think about any questions you might want to ask the panelists. And we've had some really great conversations in the chat box already. I'm just going to spotlight our panelists.
Did you want to dive in, Heather, with any of the questions that had come through the chat?
Yeah, we've got a question here from Jenny, which Ben's answered, but it'd be great to hear from the rest of you as well. Rather than offsetting in credits, how do we encourage brands to invest in ingredients that regenerate soils to improve ecosystem services? Organic farming is still too costly for many brands in the UK, and my understanding is that regenerative farming method are still subsidised. Would anyone like to respond to that?
So I think Zac,
I can elaborate.
Yeah,
I can elaborate a bit on earlier, if you like. So one of the key reasons is, as we were mentioning, understanding of the food system and what it takes to produce food in the right way. The report I just posted in the chat is actually a really good way to get people realizing just what the big costs are. So generally, for every £1 spent on food, another £1 is going to be, a £1 is going to be spent in taxation subsidy for farming, and then another £1 is going to be spent in cleaning up the aspects of poor farming, essentially. So the health impact, if it's processed food, there's a huge diabetes crisis in some countries in the world, huge obesity crises, and then looking at cleaning up our waterways and air pollution, and then also obviously now huge amounts being pumped into carbon sequestration projects and nature-based solutions. So I think, because for better or worse, the world works in financial terms, it's good to highlight to people financially what the cost of cheaper and not as good forms of agriculture are doing.
Yeah.
Mairead, did you have any questions you wanted to ask the panelists?
Ben, I think, Ben from Beds and Claire's, he actually posed, which he always likes to pose as a provocative question, Ben, which is, I know, at the heart of your thinking as well, though, which is basically, does it have to be about return on investment, as opposed to it just being about doing the right thing morally? Or am I being too naive? I think it'd be interesting to pose that. Any responses from the rest of the panel, Zac, Tom, Rory, with your reflections on that? So the case for business engaging because it's morally the right thing to do when we are in a severe climate and biodiversity crisis, versus there needing to be a very tangible return on investment in order for business to engage.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's, as I alluded to, there's the forerunners who recognize this. There's a social license to operate. That's critical, and that's coming to the fore in terms of the legitimacy, aside from brass tacks in terms of bottom line and impact from public perception, negative perception, etc. It is very much, and I think also what sort of facilitates movement or positive movement is the interrelationship with dealing with the climate agenda or climate targets within the organization. But certainly from some of our clients, we're seeing them come forward because they recognize, yeah, pragmatically, maybe it is getting ahead of regulation and such sort of implications further downstream. But also they know they need to be responsible. They know the crisis is serious, and any business wants to remain sustainable. You know, it has to ensure that it manages its growth into the future, etc. So it's still there 50, 100 years later. So there is an element of pragmatism as well.
Fantastic. I think that's probably all we've got time for today. I'm just going to share our contact.
Can we just also say, because I saw a couple of questions coming up, and I know Heather popped something in the chat box, a few questions coming up about engaging in Project Now. We'd love to discuss. It's very practically engineered and oriented towards helping business have impact. So please, if you're a business or you're an agency working with brands that want to do something seriously impactful around nature and biodiversity that they can also engage people around, then do reach out to myself and Heather. I think, Heather, we have contact details here and we'd love to pick up on individual discussions.
Fabulous. And if the panelists want to include any contact details for getting in touch with you about any of the exciting projects that you've been talking about, you're welcome to add those to the chat box. And yeah, thanks, Mairead, thanks everyone, and thanks to all of you for spending your time with us this lunchtime. I hope it was really insightful and inspiring. You can follow us at wonderroom.co on Instagram, or get in touch at mairead@wonderroom.co. And yeah, thanks so much. I'm looking forward to sharing more. We've got some more webinars lined up coming soon, so keep connected. Thanks everyone.